Hello, and welcome back to Pen and Perception, the weekly podcast where every week I was going to say job, it's really our privilege to sit down with authors, songwriters, journalists, and just any inspiring writer of all different fields, all different stripes.
Here we talk about raw and sometimes emotional topics of writers, how they got to where they are now, and the habits and tools they used to do so. We're going to hear an interview between me and Craig and our guest Kate Burns, and the main thing we're going to talk about is a poetry book and the journey which led to its creation. Kate, never before have Craig and I found ourselves virtually seated across someone who has a story like yours to tell. But the question that was really front of mind for us, and I think will be for a lot of people, is why did you want to have this conversation?
Yeah, I think I want to have this conversation because I feel like mental health, especially when it comes to creatives and anyone involved in the arts, is just such an important discussion to have. I know a lot of people pull from their creativity from their struggles, and while that can be such a great source of creating and helping other people feel seen and validated, it's also good to just talk about it and be open with it so as not to blur the lines between I'm using this to transform my pain versus this is my source of creation. I need to hold on to my pain.
Hmm. There are so many different directions we could go, but where do we start? Could we start by you taking us back to essentially a home life, your early context, just so we can understand who you are now. What exactly do we need to know about your early context? What were some of your most defining moments, early passions, parents, home life, that kind of thing? Could you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So my first book and my first series of poetry is about sexual trauma, but I've done enough therapy now to understand the root of all of that was in childhood trauma. And even though I grew up in a middle class white suburban family in Las Vegas, Nevada, uh, having parents who were emotionally disconnected from themselves or emotionally immature created a lot of discord in the household that was kind of under the surface. Like from the outside looking in, everything looked fine, but under the
Okay.
surface, things were just not great. Nobody was feeling seen. No one was feeling heard. No one was feeling validated, appreciated, valued. And I have two brothers and two sisters. So seven of us all feeling like we weren't being seen and valued and appreciated by each other was very emotionally difficult to navigate, especially as a child. So I escaped through reading. And I mean, gosh, I think a lot of writers can relate to that of just using reading as a means of escaping reality and going somewhere else and being someone else and seeing the world when you're stuck where you are.
Has it taken you time to connect those dots? Because there's been times where I've learned foundational things about myself, and sometimes it takes you hearing something or reading something. How long did it take you to kind of connect those dots between how you felt maybe in terms of your self-esteem perhaps, and how that was caused by your upbringing at home?
God, that took,
Quite a big
I
question.
know, that took all of my 20s. And I think that's why I
Okay.
care so much about being so open about mental health, is because I was convinced for so many years to just push it down and be like, no, I'm fine. I'm okay. The past is the
Yeah.
past. I mean, that's a narrative that was perpetuated in my family. The past is the past. Let it go, move on. And it's like,
Yeah.
if you don't actually work through anything that happens, you're not letting it go, you're pushing it down. You may say, you may use the
Totally.
words, I'm letting this go, but if you didn't work through it and you didn't find peace with it and take accountability and like reach out to people and work through things with them, you're not letting it go. You're pushing it as far down as you can so you can pretend it's not there. And so yeah, it took the better part of my 20s. I wouldn't say I was actually, well, and that's the thing, a healing journey starts even before any healing takes place. So I guess my healing journey was my whole life. But okay,
Right.
I started seeing some healing happening around the time I picked up my pen and started writing poetry. I think that was my conduit for finally seeing healing in my life. And so yeah, that was around like 26, 27.
Would you say writing consumed a lot of your childhood when growing up?
Surprisingly, it didn't. I remember buying a
Okay.
lot of diaries and wanting to write, but I had this deep wound of not feeling good enough. And even at a very young age, I felt like everything I was trying to do just wasn't coming out the way I wanted. So I would kind of self sabotage and get in my own way. And so I stopped myself from pursuing what I genuinely wanted to because I just didn't feel like I was ever going to be good enough.
Oh wow, that's really interesting because usually with like I always hear people who are so obsessed with like writing and like being creative when they're younger because you know when you're younger you have such a like wild imagination, but as you grow older it kind of fades, you know, instead of it being the other way around.
I definitely felt
Yeah.
that as a kid of just like, oh, I want to write, a lot of writers that I know now are like, no, it was my solace as a child, and I'm like, man, maybe if I hadn't gotten my own way, I probably would have started healing much sooner because it can be such a good conduit and a way of expressing yourself and realizing what your thoughts and feelings are by putting them out on the page.
Yeah, I mean, completely. So I'm curious to know if you answer to this question because the relationships that you have with like your family members growing up really shape who you are. I'm just curious because of the sexual trauma that you had to endure, and you have felt like a lack of trust towards men. I wonder if that extended to your male family members or if that um, wasn't the case.
Yeah, I love that you brought that up because the title of my book, All My Favorite Men Are Dead, actually stems from a question that my therapist asked me when I was 28. And we were working through the sexual trauma. We hadn't yet gotten to the childhood trauma, which is the root of it all. And I was just talking about how difficult I found it to trust men and how, it was always waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for the moment that they would turn on me and hurt me and betray me. And she asked me, are there any men that you can trust? And I feel like most people's immediate answer would be like, oh, my dad. And then I like actually thought onto those like close family relationships. I have two brothers, my father, cousins, uncles. And I realized there's not a single one of them that I could genuinely trust on a very deep emotional level that I felt that the level of trust I was able to reach with women. And that really broke my heart. And I started to realize, I'm like, who were the men that I had any kind of close bond with? And I started realizing it was like, oh, Mark Twain, Charles Dickens, Shakespeare. It's all these like men who had died but left their words behind because they were safe. They I could get to know them through the books that they wrote, but they could never betray me because they weren't alive to mess things up.
Yeah, with like trusting male family members, it feels like on a surface level you should trust them just because you know they're like your dad or your brother, just because you're related. But that doesn't mean there's any connection there, or they made any efforts to like really like connect with you and feel, you know, like actually get care
Yeah.
about you and be open about that. Yeah, I really do love the title of your book. When I found out like the origins, I was like, wow, it's so powerful, especially because it just seems to compass like your poems so well. And I kind of do relate with the whole writer thing because like I was so obsessed with reading as a kid, you know. Those books really transport you to a different world. Like it's just a different image, you know.
Yeah, completely. And it's funny because I actually didn't read a lot of poetry as a kid outside of maybe like Shel Silverstein and Dr. Seuss.
Right.
I never saw myself as a poet. I always wanted to be like a fiction writer because those were the books that I loved. And then I wrote this little poem kind of about poetry, and it's, with poetry, you don't need characters and plot. You only need feelings and thoughts. And when you're dealing with such an intense trauma brain, you can't string things along enough together to get character and plot. All you have are your feelings and your thoughts, and they're consuming you. So that's why I love poetry, to like heal from trauma, because it gets all of those feelings and all of those thoughts out of your body and gives them somewhere else to live.
Yeah, no, that's so interesting because I kind of had a similar experience when I was younger. I was so obsessed with writing, like, you know, like really long books. But then as I got older, it was poetry, which was the place where I could express my feelings. You know, it just didn't feel like there was no pressure. You could just be yourself. There's no rules of poetry. You know, you can just like put your emotions on paper and, you know, that there's nothing expected of you really. You know,
Yeah. No, I mean, Ariba's obviously, been a huge fan of poetry and writing for as long as she can remember. But for me, it took quite a while to get into it. Similar to you in a way. It just made me question whether I could even do a writing podcast at one point. Actually, like anyone who dares to talk about literature or writing on, such a deep level must have been a diehard fan of like all facets of writing since forever. And I felt like for all these people who had like these kind of deep, lifelong passions for it, and I was kind of like this latecomer in a way. But then I heard you mention actually in one of your more recent interviews on the amazing I think it's called the Unqualified Therapist podcast, I think,
Yes.
that you kind of struggles with your love for writing insofar as not being so passionate about poetry. I think you actually said we hated your poetry classes at college. Is that what you said?
Yeah, they were my least favorite classes. I couldn't stand it. Even reading, I love Shakespeare's plays, but even like going through his sonnets, I was like, I didn't connect with it. And it took me years to realize that poetry is very much like music in the
Yeah.
sense of because it's expressing feelings and thoughts and not telling a story. It's not that like music is good or bad. It's just you're either going to relate to it or you're not. If you've had these feelings, if you've had these thoughts, you're going to relate. And if you haven't, you won't relate, regardless of how good the song is. And so I was consuming poetry that I just had no grounds for relating to, because unfortunately, most college classes, even in literature nowadays, you're being taught men's literature, men's poetry, men's perspectives, and I had such deep wounds around my relations with men. I feel like if I had been introduced to more women's poetry,
Mm,
yes, this has been
yeah.
going on in my mind for years.
Yeah, I mean, that's so relatable because I study English as well, and I have the same thing with poetry classes and lectures because it just feels so like, I don't know, the way they examine it, it's just like, yeah, just, check the list of like all the things you need to like look out for. Like they don't really let you or give you the time to like have an emotional connection with your work. It's very
That
much
was
like,
GCSE English, yeah, pretty much
yeah,
as well,
exactly.
and the A
Yeah,
level too. So yeah,
yeah. I mean, the UK system is exactly the same.
yeah.
But yeah, like when you read works of women, it's like, wow, that's my story as well. Like I relate to that as well. Like when it's like with poetry by men, it's usually just very unrelatable, and it's just hard to like read it as poetry almost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one thing too, it's like I think schools really don't recognize is that when you have children who have very deep wounds in the home of not feeling seen, not feeling heard, not feeling validated, not feeling related to, then putting literature in front of them where they again don't feel seen, don't feel heard, don't feel validated. I can't relate to this. I don't see me in this. You're just furthering the distance from their ability to like reach out and really connect with that literature. I really think kids need to feel seen and validated, heard and understood in order to start gaining the skill of empathy, to be able to reach outside of
Yeah.
themselves to then see themselves in other people's work. Because once I started healing, now I can pick up a poem that does not align with anything I've thought or felt and really start to see that other perspective. Whereas before, I needed to feel seen first. I needed to know that what I was thinking and feeling was also out there.
Yeah, that's so true. Like so many kids are just like basically raised to hate books, and hate reading because
Pretty
it's just
much,
so
yeah.
unrelated to their lives. It's like, why would I want to read this? Like it means nothing to me, So you have to like search about literature when you're younger, and if you don't, then you're probably not going to end up like reading.
Yeah,
Especially because the work you're taught in school is very much like the middle class, like rich, like, man. The other narratives aren't really focused on it all.
exactly. There's not enough diversity in what we're presenting to kids within the literature. And I was a substitute teacher for a little bit, and seeing these
Okay.
kids go to the library during their library class time, and no, the kids weren't being taught how to find a book they would connect with. We have to remember that everything in this world is a skill. It needs to be taught, and then it needs to be practiced. Don't just take a kid into a library and say, go pick out a book. Teach them how to find a book that they would enjoy, because that's a skill. You're not going to connect with every book you pick up.
Exactly. Even the
Yeah.
most like avid readers don't want to read everything.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so I want to go more into like the origins of your book and the events that's based around. So you said you were raped in college, and before that, you even got to college, you were like molested by your cross country coach in high school. I know you've had this like a million times before, but I really am so sorry you went through that. And like no one deserves that kind of pain. And when I was reading your poetry book, it was so striking, like all the things that you felt, everything that was going through your mind, like it was very raw.
I just
Um,
want to say very quickly, we don't know where your line is of being comfortable, so you can totally just lead there. So
yeah. So we were just wondering if there was anything about that day that you're comfortable sharing with us, whether it's like feelings, emotions, like anything really.
Yeah, I the day I like wrote my first poem that ended up like being in this book, that actually ended up expressing like things that I had been pushing down for so long. It was about 2 nights after I attempted to take my own life for I'm going to call it the last time. It's never happening again. And it was just such a low moment. And it was very, in a very real sense to me, it was very do or die. I did not know how to keep living in this world. I didn't know. I didn't want to anymore. It was too hard. It was too painful. I could not see a light at the end of the tunnel. I didn't think things were going to get better. And then I was able, I was up one night. I couldn't sleep. I was just absolutely miserable. And I picked up my phone and I just started writing all of these thoughts that were racing around in my mind out. And it ended up being like the first, like one of the main poems that is in this book. And I think that was like a real turning point in my ability to find a way to stay. And that's why one of the poems is called Stay, because that's what I really want to do with this book. Is like I want to give women who are in the same place of they've just been so hurt and betrayed by men, and they look around and they don't think it's going to get any better. We live in a patriarchal society. Men have all the power. They continue to be treated a certain way by men. They continue to attract certain men into their lives, and they just don't see a way out. And I want them to feel seen, and I want them to know that they're understood, and I want them to see that there is a way of staying. And that's why I wanted to leave every other page of my book blank, because I wanted to give women the opportunity to do what actually helped me. Like feeling seen and feeling validated are amazing, and they're very key to the first steps of healing, but getting your own thoughts and your own pain and your own words out onto the paper, whether that's writing or drawing or just scribbling your anger and your hurt, like that's, I think, what helps. That's the release that I think is needed.
Yeah, creative expression is such a like healthy form of releasing that kind of like pain that builds up.
Mm.
And it kind of goes back to this quote I wanted to mention, like I heard recently, and it goes something like, "Your secrets make you sick, mine were almost lethal." It just kind of reminds me of how women who are put in a similar situation like yours, who are, violated in that way, just feel all alone in the world. It's the kind of thing that just eats away at you because it's so incredibly isolating to go through something like that. Because it's like, who do you tell? Like, can you even tell anybody? Like, will you get judged? Because, like you said, like victims are often blamed in situations like these. It's like, oh, you asked for it, oh, the clothes you were wearing, really like
Yeah.
messed up things like that. I mean, I was just wondering, like, who was the first person that you told?
Um, the first person I told when I was molested is also the first person I told when I was raped. It was my best friend at the time, but she's the same age as me, and I think that's what's really hard about like when you have childhood trauma and you don't have adults in your life that you feel that deep emotional connection with, because the advice you're gonna and the support and the help you're gonna be able to get from somebody who's at the same stage of life as you and knows what you know and doesn't know what you don't know is not going to be the same as somebody who's been like, okay, I've been there and here's how I got through it. Here's my advice. Here's what I have to offer from somebody who's much older. And I think that's really valuable, and I think that's why the childhood trauma, even more so than the sexual trauma, was was key in where I ended up mentally, because I think I could have been able to mentally and emotionally handle the sexual trauma better had I had that key support from people that I trusted who were older that I could go to. In an ideal world, those are your parents.
Mm.
But even just having any adult that I trusted. And I think the worst part about the worst part for me about being molested by my cross country coach was that for 4 years I had seen him as like a father. He was closer to me than my own dad was.
Yeah.
And so the break in trust that gave me with any adult moving forward was like, I have no one to turn to. It is only my peer group. They are all that I can trust.
That is so awful. Like honestly, it's just so sad when people like in positions of power, just like people older than you, just take advantage of like literal kids. It's like I don't know, man. It's just so sad.
Yeah.
Yeah. When I watch documentaries, like those panorama dramas and like really horrific things that happen to people, there is a lot of fear and self-deprecation that goes into these documentaries, and more specifically, fear causes silence, and that's usually why. That's often why people find it so difficult to kind of come out and share their experiences. How did you weigh whether or not to say anything?
When it came to my cross country coach, I was still, even though I had turned 18, I was still a senior in high school. I hadn't graduated yet, and I was still living at home. And I didn't say anything because I was so afraid I was going to get in trouble. And if that isn't the mind of a child, like, he can get away on a legal technicality all he wants that I was 18. But if that isn't the mind of a child, I thought for sure I'd be grounded. I thought for sure my parents would blame me and say that, they were very Catholic, very religious. And I felt like I knew if I told my mom, she would blame me for it and say, like, you tempted a good man. Like, you did this. And so I was like, well, I don't want to get in trouble. So let me just get home safely. And it was really, looking back from like now and having the memories, is really interesting to see something that was very key in both instances. And in both moments, they were such throwaway kind of things, like comments that didn't like really hit me until later. Was at an earlier point in the day, my coach had made a comment. We were in the woods because I went for a race with him. It was very common that we would go to away
Yeah.
races. It was the first time that nobody else had come, which struck me as weird. But so we were running in the woods to prepare for the 10K the next day. And we stopped at one point because I was getting out of breath, and he made a comment of, like, somebody could be murdered out here and nobody would know because we were so far away from everything. And I laughed at that. And then looking back, I'm like, what a great place to get somebody subconsciously in a sort of space of fear. Like, obviously, I didn't think this person would kill me, but like, what a great way to sort of subconsciously plant a little seed of fear in somebody. And then with when I was raped in college by my sister's ex-boyfriend, he made a similar comment of, I wanted to go home. And he was like, well, I'm really drunk and driving all the way back to your college. Like, we could die. So let's just go to, my place, because we'll be safer, because I don't want to drive. And it's like, the way in which, and I don't know, I don't think they're monsters. I don't know if they plan that, but I'm like, I find it interesting now looking back, the way in which in both instances there was sort of like a threat of death, like placed on my subconscious, of just like priming me to be afraid.
Yeah, it's almost fear of the worst. I mean, going back to what you said before about like, what your parents, like how you think your parents would react. When I went through something similar, I had the exact same thought process. It was, I'm going to get in trouble, I'm going to get yelled at. And I was like, why would I think that, Like, I don't know what ingrains like you to think that, like growing up, or whether it's like society, but like, why would you think that someone else's like actions, you'd get in trouble for that? And I don't know, it's just such a difficult mindset to be in.
Yeah. Yeah.
In that, with all of that happening, did it take someone to kind of ask the right questions for you to open up? And if you're willing to share, what were some of those questions?
What's really interesting, it wasn't necessarily questions. It was because I opened up to my best friend. I would say it took a long time to open up to I don't know, my parents or anyone outside of my very close emotional circle. But what was really messed up about the situation in which I was raped was that, because it wasn't what I had thought, I was always like trained to believe, like, rape is a stranger in the alley behind a dumpster leaving you for dead. And so for the longest time, I held this like shame about it, and I referred to it as sex I didn't want to have. It's like I had sex but I didn't want to. And in a weird turn of events, I joined a sorority when I transferred colleges, and they had sexual assault, a 2-day mandatory sexual assault training. And it was the very first time anybody had given me a definition of rape is when you don't want to have sex and somebody has sex with you. And it just blew my mind. It's like, if you didn't want that and it happened, that was rape. And I was like, that was the very first time I was like, I was raped. And that was 3 years later.
So just
Yeah.
to clarify, sorry, Ariba, would you like to go ahead?
Oh, I was just gonna say that, but I don't know what it is, but like especially when women go through these kind of like things, it just feels like if someone went through something worse than you can't open up or speak about it because, at least it isn't this, or at least it wasn't that. And it's just so sad that, like, your pain or, like, experiences of trauma is often not valid if it wasn't, like, the most extreme version of that thing,
Yeah.
Growing up, did you have any conversations around consent and like sexual relationships with like your parents, maybe, or
This also
like
put
at
me at
all?
a massive disadvantage because my family was so Catholic. My mom took us out of every sex ed training that was offered in schools, and she had
Ah,
to stay
okay.
home and watch Catholic chastity videos.
Yeah, and a
Yeah,
similar upbringing as well. It's just,
yeah.
shield you from it and,
I think I was taking out those classes as
um,
well, actually. So yeah,
yeah, like, act like it doesn't happen.
Maybe in the public school system, when they had those sex ed classes like once a year, that they were being told that, but I wasn't in those. I was just staying at home watching some woman tell me that if I have sex with men, then I'll be like a chewed piece of gum.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
It's so sad how that happens. Like, it should be mandatory regardless of what parents say.
should be. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Because kids need this. They need this information because whether or not we want to accept it, admit it, recognize it, teenagers are sexually active, and teenagers are being, and especially female teenagers are being approached by men. And honestly, we don't just need sex ed in high school. We need to take the teenage girls separate and be like, this is like, these are the list of creeps, these are the list of perverts, these are the list of red flags to stay away from. If a grown man says things like this, does things like this, these are huge red flags letting you know he's not safe.
Exactly. The fact that kids aren't taught that or it's not, like, mandatory is just so dangerous.
Yeah.
Um, so triggers manifest differently, like, when it comes to, like, any traumatic event. What kind of things did you, like, feel, like, uncomfortable with or fearful for, like, after the assault, and do they still play in your mind?
I think after everything, I think my biggest triggers were more around betrayal than they were around sex. I in a weird way, it was almost a silver lining that I had been sexually active before being molested and raped because I understood what consensual sex, like in my body and in my mind, I knew what consensual sex sort of felt like. Um, and so for me, I think the what ended up happening was even more so than my body being violated by these men. It was, this was a man I thought of as a father, this was a man I thought of as a brother. He had given my sister a promise ring, they had dated for 5 years. Like, I thought I could trust him, like, so completely. In both instances, I thought these were men I could trust. And so I think the triggers for me ended up being more in close relationships with men, whether romantic or otherwise, and just constantly being on my guard and so hyper vigilant and so tuning into their language, what they would say, like, because I blamed myself, because I looked back in hindsight and I could see the red flags and I could see the moments where things didn't add up, and I remembered feeling like, that's weird, and I blamed myself for ignoring